Next from Chicago, we head to the City Club of Chicago to get an update on the future of state pensions and their effect on the state employee. This runs about 50 minutes.
Msall from the Civic Federation, give him a round of applause. Long-time pal with the City Club, who's famous for many things, probably most for writing a chapter in the 4th edition of the book The Mayors. Can't remember who did that book. It's some very bright professor, right, Stella? Okay, next we have from the Fighting 27th District, the Honorable Matt Murphy, Palatine. From the equally fighting 9th District, State Senator Daniel Biss.
A lot of fighting, Jay.
And coming all the way from Springfield, without a passport, we have the Honorable Amanda Vinicky, who is the reporter for the
Illinois Public Radio.
Illinois Public Radio. Give her a round of applause. And she still works with this fella Crawford, so give her, as they say in Latin, Father, show her a little Rachmanis. Okay. That's an inside joke for a few of you looking around, a very few. Okay, starting off 6 or 7 minutes to set the stage. Lawrence Msall, you're up first. Then we'll have the 2 state senators, and then Amanda, you'll correct all of them.
All right, I can do that for sure.
Thank you. I am Lawrence Msall, the president of the Civic Federation. For those of you who are aware, we have several members here, but the Civic Federation is a nonpartisan government research organization. We were founded about 120 years ago by Jane Addams, Bertha Palmer, and Lyman Gage, legendary Chicagoans who really were concerned about the condition of our city and were aiming to improve the delivery of government services. It was about that time when Chicago had an emerging reputation with corruption and problems. So the Civic Federation got involved in everything from helping elect reform candidates to paying for Pinkerton guards to help the city collect its tax revenues. The city of Chicago has never had a problem levying taxes. It did have a problem getting the tax money from the businesses into the treasury, and that's where the Pinkerton guards came from. As you all know, we got rid of corruption in Chicago about 100 years ago. And since that time, the Civic Federation has been focusing on tax fiscal policy. It is not really a proud moment for any of us in this room when we look at the condition of the state of Illinois, our pensions, and what it means for our future. We're going to hear from Governor Rauner next week, his plan for moving Illinois forward. He faces a almost inconceivably difficult time. The budget that he inherited that the state's operating under right now has a $1.5 billion hole in it. So before he even took office, the state was continuing to deteriorate. He's going to present his spending plan, which will include what to do about the pensions. Almost 25 cents of every state tax dollar generated from the state source revenues goes into the pension and pension-related debt. That's higher than anywhere else in the country. Illinois has a lot of uniquenesses, a lot of firsts, but it's nothing that you would seek. In the case of the state of Illinois pension system, many of you are aware that over $110 billion in unfunded liability just for the state funds. There was significant progress just almost a year ago when the state passed some pension reform for its pension funds, basically saving the defined benefit plan, changing the rate of which benefits would grow, but still keeping the plans basically intact. Many of you are aware that that is up in the Supreme Court of Illinois, which we expect will hear the case in March and hopefully make a decision before the General Assembly has to adjourn at the end of May. Without that constitutional imprimatur, the governor has to rely on $1 billion less in available budget relief that the pension reform legislation would have passed. For the Civic Federation, we're certainly very eager to see what Governor Rauner's plan is for moving forward. We know it's going to be a very difficult situation. We know it's going to be very hard and painful for just about anyone who relies on government, relies on the state, relies on services from the state. I want to point out, and I think, I know all of our panelists would want to reinforce this. The government workers have done nothing wrong. The state employees, the city employees, the teachers, they all went to work, they all did their job, and they were promised a benefit, a retirement benefit on their retirement. Unfortunately, the taxpayers also did their job. They paid their taxes, they expected their government to operate efficiently and effectively, and so now everyone is forced in a situation of living with a government that did not adequately fund its pensions. There is culpability on all sides. We let this get out of hand. We let it get to a level that is so outrageous, most other states can't even understand how Illinois continues to operate this way. Biggest concern we have going in right now, while we wait for the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of the pension reforms legislation that has been passed, is what happens to the municipalities, including the City of Chicago, City of Bolingbrook, Mayor Clara is here, City of Aurora, they have officials here. They are facing enormously difficult decisions in their operations because of a pension system that was created by the state legislature, whose benefits were determined by the state legislature, and whose funding mechanisms were determined by the state legislature. And more of their property tax levy is going into their pension system. There are communities in Illinois where over 100% of their pension levy goes into their police and fire pension fund, and it's not enough to keep up. We have to move forward on additional fronts. The City of Chicago faces a $600 million increase in its contributions to the pension funds just for police and fire in the coming year. Mayor Emanuel does not have $600 million in his budget for that contribution. He will be in a horrible he will be facing a horrible problem, which is, what does he do? Does he raise taxes by $600 million, basically doubling or tripling the city's property tax levy, or does he try to gut the city operations to make room for that? Because the state of Illinois, which mandates that funding schedule, did not provide any means or additional funding for him. So we're facing a desperate is not too dramatic a word for what we face. And as Father said in his invocation, we desperately need action for the state to move forward. We desperately need to get this monster off the back of everyone who cares about state government and state services. Thank you.
Okay, good way to start. Just in case some of you are worried, we do have at the end, at the bar, there'll be small little vials of hemlock. For those of you who, after this, there's no reason, why play on? Matt, you have the lower number for your, no, Dan Biss, you're number 9. Okay, State Senator Dan Biss, 6 or 7 minutes, your take on what has been said and your views.
Well, thank you to the City Club and to Paul and Jay for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back and endure the humiliations of Paul's introductions, which are always dramatic.
Can't argue.
Notwithstanding my pleasure about being here, it's an awkward time. The Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in March, and there's, I think, no sense in pretending that I have anything useful to say about how that will proceed. So what I thought I would talk about this afternoon is a topic that I believe will be very much on the agenda for discussion regardless of how the Supreme Court rules, and that is the proposal that you've heard a lot about to move public employees away from a defined benefit pension into a defined contribution scheme like a 401k. If you saw the list of policy proposals that were communicated in writing to the General Assembly by the governor after his State of the State address last Wednesday, that was very much on his list, and I expect will continue to be on his list. And so I think that's a really important policy question that deserves being thought through on its own. Those who oppose this change, of whom I consider myself one, ordinarily argue by saying, well, look, pardon me, ordinarily argue by saying, look, the majority of public employees in Illinois don't have access to Social Security, and it simply, thank you very much, it simply makes no sense to move a set of people who don't have Social Security into a defined contribution 401k scheme, and so you can't do it without adding the cost of Social Security, and that's certainly true. And another argument that's often made is, well, these systems are currently in debt. They're relying on contributions coming in. If you close them off to new contributions in, that will accelerate the rate at which we have to pay down the debt, which is also true. But I think those arguments are not really often well heard by the proponents of these changes, because the view seems to be, this is such an important thing to do that we can somehow overcome those technical concerns. And so what I wanted to do is to instead take on the policy proposal on its merits rather than talk around some of the technical concerns. So what do the proponents of moving public employees into a 401k typically say? Well, the first thing they say is, well, you know, the private sector did this years ago, and so of course the public sector has to as well. And then if you ask my father what he thinks about that, he would say if the private sector were to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, should the public sector do that as well? And there's no response to that. So then you move on to the second argument, which is that, hey, you know, people are living longer. The systems were designed when people's life expectancy was in the late, you know, high 60s, low 70s. It's just unsustainable at this point. And that word unsustainable is the one that I think demands the most analysis. First of all, under what circumstances might a pension system be unsustainable? It might be unsustainable if you're not willing to make any changes ever. If people live longer and longer and longer and you're never willing to tweak the retirement age, never willing to make any changes to benefit packages on a going forward basis, then that could eventually become unsustainable. That's why Social Security makes changes periodically. It's why defined benefit pensions in the private sector make changes. It's why defined benefit pensions in the public sector have changes made to them, as has happened not only in Illinois but in most states across the country. But once you're willing to make those changes, it's a little mysterious what unsustainable means. And I think what unsustainable really means in this context is expensive. Not unsustainable at all, but expensive. And what's really meant is, you know, if people are going to live into their 80s or 90s, then providing a pension that assures that after retirement, sometime in your 60s, you'll be able to maintain a reasonable standard of living until death is expensive. And it is. But the question that one needs to ask on the flip side is, are we prepared to design a retirement system in this country where people don't get to retire sometime in their 60s and have a reasonable standard of living until death? And if that's the decision we're going to make, who have we become? So if the change that's being proposed to a 401k is allowing people to retire sometime in their 60s in dignity is just a bad idea, then I don't think we need to sign ourselves up. If the change is not that, then I think we need to analyze what's happened in the private sector as this change has been made. And here's where we benefit significantly from living in 2015 and not 1985. Because the transition to the 401k in the private sector is well underway, has been ongoing for now around 4 decades. And so we don't need to speculate anymore. We can look and analyze and ask. And the jury is in. It's not always popular to say, but the jury is in. The 401k experiment in the private sector has been a failure. So for instance, the median account balance in the 401k today in this moment of record high market times is $31,000. The National Institute on Retirement Security estimates that the gap in retirement savings between what people have and what they need in America is between $6 and $14 trillion. And so the system that we are asking if we should replicate has not worked. And I think what we need to do from the vantage point of 2015 is ask ourselves what hasn't worked, and then if we're going to design something for the public sector, how do we avoid those pitfalls? And those pitfalls are several. First of all, 401ks, typically the participation is optional, contribution levels are discretionary, and people tend not to participate in a high enough level. Second of all, relieving investment responsibilities in the hands of people who are not trained professionals in an era of increasing specialization. Why would one do this? Most of all, by fragmenting the investment decisions rather than pooling people together. Not only are you not taking advantage of economies of scale, which push down fees, but you're also not taking advantage of the benefits of truly pooling risk in a way that allows you to have an optimal investment allocation. And so this, we now know, we've seen this play out. It's played out with significant consequences. And the lessons, I think, are very clear about how to design a real 21st century retirement plan that can achieve a lot of the goals of people who are talking about the challenges with the current underfunded systems without replicating those mistakes. And I guess I would just close by saying, as we sit here from the vantage point of 2015, asking these agonizingly difficult questions about what to do about the mountain of debt we've already accrued, and presented with an opportunity to change the structure of our benefits going forward, let's not take one set of mistakes we've made and then replace them with a completely different set of mistakes. Let's design a modern system that avoids these errors, avoids these inefficiencies, and achieves what's needed for the government to function and be able to afford its other needed services, but simultaneously provides true and efficiently delivered retirement security for the workers who are serving the public. So with that, I look forward to the questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. By the way, for those of you who are new to the City Club, this is just typical of the intellectual level of all of our speakers. Dan, I think, got his PhD with MIT. Yeah, so that's just typical. There's no big... Oh, by the way, my leader, Jay Doherty, has suggested, and I see her sitting right in front of me, we do have the Republican leader of the Senate, Christine Radagno, the pride and joy of southwestern Illinois, southwest suburb. All right. No pressure on you, Mr. Murphy. You got your leader here. You following Professor Biss? Go right ahead.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation from Jay and Paul. It's great to be with you guys. I have never been up here for this. I've been to this lunch because, as we all know, it's better than where else I would have eaten today, which, given the subject matter, I suspect is why you're here too, let's be honest. The hemlock was good, Paul. That was well played. It is. This is a challenge, and it is one that has been particularly thorny to us and really on the front burner for those of us in the General Assembly for a number of years now. I think Lawrence's point about blame and looking backward is somewhat well taken. I had a conversation with somebody upstairs, I got here earlier, who is tired of his wife being demonized as a teacher for merely being a public employee. And I think it's important that blame about how we got here not spend too much time, too much of our energy, because the problem itself and how we move forward is substantial enough without divisive rhetoric. I say that as a member of the body that is probably primarily responsible for it, and I recognize that might be a little self-serving, but I think it's nonetheless important that we try and look forward and solve what is an about $111 billion problem that we will all have some effect in and it will affect us. The other thing, and I have enjoyed thus far working with Senator Biss. We worked closely together on the last bill. I continue to believe that was a balanced approach that tried to strike the balance between solving this problem for the long term while going as little into benefits as we absolutely needed to solve the problem. It was a difficult needle to thread, which was evidenced by the fact that it took years to pass. The Supreme Court, we're going to find out probably not soon enough, frankly, what they think of it. But I continue to think that that was a reasonable compromise to strike and would have served everybody's interest best, although I know that there is some disagreement on that. This is one major issue, pensions, and its impact on us. We've got a new administration in Springfield, and I think it would be fair to say that Governor Rauner has hit the ground running. There are a lot of things facing this state, though, that are going to require some difficult decisions and difficult choices and compromise coming up in the near term. And I sincerely hope we're all in a position to contribute to that. There will be pain. There's no doubt about that. But I always try and stress the picture of what this state and this city can look like on the other side of the pain. Because we focus so much on where we are right now and how difficult this is and how intractable our problems are. And we sometimes lose sight of what the picture on the other side could be, of an Illinois and a Chicago that is leading the nation in opportunity for the people who live here to work the best job they're capable of doing. A school system that is the model of the nation. We have so much going for us here as a state. Things that we in Springfield haven't been able to screw up despite our collective best efforts. And if we can get our house in order, if we can go through these difficult things, the picture on the other side for this town and this state is exceedingly bright. And for those who held the pessimistic view that it's already too late, I would submit to you that I don't believe that. And if you're in government and you feel that way, maybe it's time to step out and let somebody else in. With regard to pensions, there's going to be a lot of things to consider. I am not as dire on the 401k as Daniel is. I think there is potential for savings in it. I think it's important that we also not buy into the theory that we all have to wait on the Supreme Court before we take another whack at pensions. We may not know for 2 more legislative sessions what the Supreme Court's ultimately going to do. 2 more years with this thing growing at 10% a year is a problem doesn't strike me as the right approach. So I do hope that the governor will be prepared to lead on this as he's attempting to on other things. I think that if you're looking for a tier 3 with a 401k for employees, I think it's a reasonable conversation to have. I think people need to understand that shifting the burden of retirement expectations from taxpayer to individual is the ultimate goal of the 401k. You know, the fact that we want to make that shift isn't necessarily accepting a bad outcome. We would like this model to work, but the question about are we going to be able to allow people to retire comfortably in their 60s isn't really the question now. There are people retiring comfortably in their 50s. And what people who don't have that pension but are paying the bill are worried about is who's going to help me take care of my ability to retire? Now, I don't begrudge anybody their deal in the pension system. I'm in that pension system. But the reality is we have to look at the cost of paying for this. We have to look at, are we denying people who don't have these pensions the opportunity to better fund their own retirements because of the taxes they're going to pay to fund the public employee pensions? That is part of the balance to be struck here. We also have to look at, to the extent that higher taxes are going to be called upon to pay this bill. The last time taxes were raised in this state, we saw the largest hike in unemployment of any state in the country. Now, you can argue, and some will, that that money went to actually save the pension system, and money did go into the pension system from the tax rates. You can say it stabilized a lot of things, and that as a result of that it was worthwhile, and people make that argument. But you can't ignore that higher taxes impact job creation. And for a state that's had the job record we do, we need to be sensitive to that as we figure out our way to go forward. I hope we're all open to whatever ideas are out there. I also hope that we all, whether it's supporting a 401k or opposing a 401k, are willing to look at data and consider information and not cling unnecessarily to our own ideological predispositions. This is going to be a fascinating year in Springfield. I am hopeful that we have an opportunity to get more done in a productive way in this spring session than we have seen perhaps in a generation, and I'm looking forward to being a part of it. And I look forward to your questions too. Thanks.
Okay, Amanda, bring us all together. You come from the belly of the beast. You're the one. You're down there. Go right ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, hello, and bear with me. This is odd because normally this is the sort of event that I would be live tweeting instead of up here on the panel. So that's a bit odd, number one. Number two, you may be wondering, why am I sitting at this table with 2 of the legislators that were on the conference committee that developed what eventually led to the massive pension overhaul and the leader of one of the state's foremost research institutes that has spent years looking at the pension issue. So that's a very good question, and I have just about as good of an answer to that as I do to the question of what the Supreme Court will do with Senate Bill 1. And the answer to both of those is that I have no clue. So,
Glad to have you here, Amanda. There you go.
Just kidding, though. No, just kidding. As somebody who has been following this for a decade, that's what I hope to do, is maybe be able to cut through some of this very complicated stuff and tell it like it is, in perhaps ways that elected officials may be unable, and also to give firsthand observations as somebody who has been following this for the better part of a decade now. And take a moment and think about how much in that time the pension discourse had changed. I know when I first started covering this, pension committee hearings were held in 122B. It's this like small little nook of a pretend to be room that is off of the State House chapel. And so needless to say, it was not a popular place to be. It wasn't crowded. I remember covering also a committee meeting with then House Republican leader Tom Cross and the Commercial Club's Ty Fainer. And this was before I put even my stories on the web. So I couldn't even go back if I wanted to see what I wrote at that time. It was that long ago. But I'm guessing that it had a phrase somewhere along the lines of an exercise in legislative futility or something like that. Because at that point, it just pensions were a confusing word, and it didn't get a whole ton of interest. It was a problem, but it just hadn't caught on. And now look, and obviously pensions are everywhere. I am guessing that this is one of many pension panels that have been held in this very room previously, and there are going to be plenty more to come. Pensions are the subject of editorials, they're on billboards, there are groups that are devoted solely to this. You know, for a time, even when Senate Bill 1 was in its formation and kind of the year leading up to that, my editor had thought about literally making pensions my entire beat, like leave the rest of the General Assembly stuff aside. And that was at a point when we had 2 people covering state government, and they wanted to devote 1 just to pensions, because particularly in Springfield, where you have so many state workers, it's seen as that big of a deal. And also think about the change in terms of there were so many sweetheart deals once upon a time being thrown out right and left to a lot of people who, for whatever way, had curried favor with legislators and were able to be slipped into a bill. And it's a lot of that that has made a bad name for pensions. And when people say, well, gosh, they're exorbitant in Illinois, there are some cases of that, and those are a lot of those sweetheart deals. That doesn't really happen anymore. Every pension measure is given a very high level of scrutiny by the media and by legislators themselves. And I say that because, as I kind of was noting before there, this is not a fun issue. I mean, in Illinois, we have medical marijuana, same-sex marriage, even the income tax. These are issues that you could consider, like, quote-unquote, sexy from a news perspective if you're going to be government and dorky about it, like I prefer to be. But actuarial estimates do not reach that level. And yet we, again, are so very focused on pensions, and you have to be at $111 billion of unfunded liability. I looked it up on, Forbes, and just putting it in perspective, because I think that is helpful. I guess the Chicago Cubs are worth $1 billion or so. So I'm a White Sox fan. Seems a little overvalued to me, but we could buy more than 100 billion of these Cubs teams. They have every NFL team 3 times over is worth $100 billion. $323 tax rate rebate to every U.S. citizen, not just residents of Illinois. That's how big we're talking. So anyway, big pensions, and it clearly shows no signs of fading, particularly if the Supreme Court does find the pension law to be unconstitutional. And I know that the prevailing wisdom right now is that that's what's going to happen. And people particularly look to the Kenerva decision that said that healthcare benefits are part of the guarantee as reason why they think that the Supreme Court justices in Illinois will toss Senate Bill 1 out. And there's also good reason for that. Obviously, you read that pension clause, it's short, it's sweet, it's to the point. And I think you could also, despite legislators' attempts to put this, prelude to the law justifying what they needed to do, that you could very well make the argument that not everything has been done to come to the rescue of pensions at this point. For example, the 2011 tax increase was rolled back. If it was, if legislators were going to do more, they could have raised rates higher, they could have kept it going on. Regardless, could have.
There you go. Hey, is that your dad? Is that your dad?
But
all right, go ahead.
It's Daniel's dad.
Dan. All right.
Not my dad.
Amanda, I don't want to impair or diminish your ability to finish.
Thank you.
Hurry up.
All right. Not my dad.
Could be.
Point being that you look at what the U.S. Supreme Court did with the Affordable Care Act, and I think that shows that you really never can predict what justices will do. So it's way too early to make that prediction. So let's say, for the sake of argument, though, that the court does toss Senate Bill 1. Some factors to consider are, well, obviously, we have a new governor. And I do think that changes things, because whereas Pat Quinn had said he was going to work night and day to resolve the pension crisis, he was pretty much on a ship, like waving a pension flag and just saying, do something about it. And he never put forth a plan. He never had a proposal. There was never any legislation. I don't expect that we're going to get that out of Bruce Rauner. Whereas candidate Rauner had very kind of vacuous policies. Now that he has become governor, he has gotten quite specific in certain instances. And we don't know yet what that means for pensions, but I would venture that when he is good and ready, he will put forth a very specific proposal. His turnaround plan that he has put out, those 2 pages that Senator Biss referred to earlier, did give us some indications. And so just to quickly go through those, he calls for protecting the accrued benefits for retirees and current workers. So keep what you have. He just wants to move it going forward. And there are, of course, constitutional questions with that as well. And then he says moving workers into either tier 2 and or a 401k style plan. And then he has this exception for police and firefighters, but we don't know what that means. And then he also calls for a, quote, permanent pension relief through a constitutional amendment. And there's no indication as to what that will be. During one of the gubernatorial debates, I had asked both he and Governor Quinn, what do you think about the constitutional amendment? Do you need to get rid of Article 13, Section 5, so that you can be freed from the shackles the Constitution gives right now in terms of changing benefits? And at that point, he said that it was a good guarantee. So what exactly he means by constitutional amendment leaves a whole lot of questions. And so clearly there is a lot to look there. I think the Speaker has put forth his cost shift proposal previously. There may be a return to that. I think that will be a very hard sell when you have Governor Rauner wanting to proclaim himself the education governor, and he also has talked about a property tax freeze. Shifting pension costs onto school districts would be very difficult if he wants to continue that. There's also, the Ralph Martiri idea, re-amortize the pension debt, Cullerton's consideration theory.
Okay, Amanda, sum it up.
What have you. So there we go. We'll move to, I guess,
I'm your editor. Sum it up.
That the Supreme Court will, I think people are waiting for the Supreme Court to give guidance. And so, whereas Senator Murphy would like legislators to move ahead, I think we're going to see Rauner put forth a proposal. But for the most part, people are very much going to be waiting to see what they can do until anything actually happens in the General Assembly before taking those tough votes.
Great. A great debut by Amanda Vinicky. All right, if you have a question, we have our folks coming around to, I had a question. Unfortunately, both of you answered it, so I'm not going to, my question was, is anything going to be done before the Supreme Court makes its decision on pensions? And maybe. An optimist. Well,
yeah, no, I think there's a chance of that. Look, I made the point before. I think people do want to know what the Supreme Court's going to do, and that it is potentially valuable. The Circuit Court didn't give us any information whatsoever or any guidance. Hopefully, the Supreme Court will uphold it. If they don't, hopefully they'll at least give some guidance as to what we may or may not be able to do. But in the interim, you could create a Tier 3 and put new hires going forward into a 401k if you could make the math work to make that make sense. I don't think we need to close the door to that at this time, but sure, we'd love a quick expedited decision, but I don't think we're going to get it. But I also don't think we want to wait 2 years to act on a problem that's growing by about $10 billion a year.
I think that's right in terms of not waiting for the state to deal with its problem, but it's even more important regarding the local governments, because the risk is that while we wait for the Supreme Court to figure out what they're going to do with that law, our local governments are suffering. And it's not to be melodramatic that we say that the Chicago Public Schools have $1 billion budget deficit in the coming year. The Chicago Public Schools are not able to open. The economic impact on our city as well as our state is very significant. And as I talked about, the local governments, the municipalities are straining under the weight of their pension system, in particular the police and fire pension system.
Okay, we have to have real short answers. We have a lot of questions. From Tommy Ryan from the Chicago Firefighters Union. I'll answer your question, Tom. Tom asked, why are there no representatives from labor on this panel? The response is very quick. I didn't invite them. Okay. That takes care of that one. From Al Manning, do you favor a state constitutional amendment? If yes, what changes would you propose? Starting with you, Dan. Well, do you let me rephrase it.
Lots of state constitutional amendments, but I guess you mean on this subject. I think there's two things to say very quickly. One is I think that it's really important for there to be some protection. I think just repealing Article 13, Section 5 would be really a bad idea. And the other thing I would say is there's a point to the New Hampshire Constitution that obligates not the payment of the benefit, but the payment of the employer into the fund. And if that's protected, then that solves the other problem. And I could envision a compromise that retains some protection of the benefit, but changes the structure of that protection and puts in place a guarantee of employer funding that could be, I think, a sensible way forward. But I'd have to see details of the governor's proposal before weighing in.
Again, it's really hard to argue about what changes you would make to the Constitution. All of us have different ideas about what was included. Having talked to some of the participants in 1970, now they're a little bit older, but they still can't remember what they were really focusing on, most of them, in terms of the pension clause, in terms of what they were trying to protect. The best description that we heard is prior to 1970, pensions were viewed as a gratuity, and so that the Constitutional Convention was aimed at raising that protection from being a gratuity that could be taken away, that the government could fund or not fund, and make it into the right of a contract. But even a contract, whether it's the federal Constitution or the state Constitution, there are limits to it. The Constitution doesn't stand on one section. It has to be read in its entirety. So we remain hopeful, and that the Supreme Court is going to look at what the implications are, both for what the General Assembly tried. There's a presumption that it's constitutional what the General Assembly does. To meet that burden, you have to show that it was clearly unconstitutional. And then when you look at what the balancing test that the federal government requires, the federal Supreme Court requires when deciding the constitutionality of a contract protection, that could be applied. So I, like everyone else on this panel, does not know what the state elected Supreme Court justices will do, but I take a lot of comfort in the fact that Mike Madigan told us that 4 of the 7 would agree with him as the pension provisions.
Not to correct you, Lawrence, but it would have to be at least 5.
No, 4.
That's the trouble, Ed. They don't. Think about it. We'll explain it later. You don't think the Supreme Court has structured roll call votes? All right.
They might.
Chris, help them out here. Okay, moving on. All right. By the way, you're right. In 1970, I interviewed one of the guys. It was a non-issue. It was just, they don't even remember it. They just don't remember. It was just the next item. Okay, this is from Brent Engel. Good question. If the city of Chicago does not pay increased amounts to the police and fire fund in 2016, this is for you, Lawrence, will Illinois legislature enact a clause which allows them to redirect state grants from Chicago to the police and fire funds? It's an easy one.
The existing state law, which requires the contribution to start at to get to 90% funded in 25 years, does have a provision where there will be an intercept of the state resource. Of the city of Chicago resources if they don't meet the mandatory funding requirement. However, it raises real questions where they get that money, that $600 million, and that's part of the predicament. So that was part of the reform legislation that increased the police and fire retirement age from 50 to 55 that said the city had to go on a 25-year funding plan to get to 90%. And if they don't, then they're at risk for the intercept from of state resources. But as significant from our perspective as well, the city would be in violation of state law and would lose some of its standing of saying it's done everything that the state required as this issue continues to be litigated.
Well, all right, if you want to say it like that, okay. Pretty good answer. This is from, well, we have a lot of, Tommy, we got the Teamsters have a question, the gentleman in front of me, the Teachers Pension Fund has a question. Let me just put them all together. This is from Raymond. Whoa, where are you, Raymond? Oh, I didn't know. Okay. Pensions are deferred wages. I have to put the proper, let me say that again. Take two. Pensions are deferred wages. Employees pay into their retirement security. Why do we allow the state and city of Chicago not to pay the normal retirement security costs that every other employer must pay? Isn't this wage theft?
Well, I mean, the full pension payment is more than the normal employer cost right now because of all of the debt we're trying to catch up to. So for certainly the last 4 or 5 years at a minimum, the full payment has been made from the employer of the normal cost. The problem is you're trying to catch up to years and years and years of either using bad numbers, people stubbornly living too long, or not making the payment in the first place. So, you know, the normal cost is being paid. It's catching up to the debt that's hard. Anybody who's familiar with compound interest, and I shudder to bring this up with Daniel up here in case I get it wrong, but it's great when it's your friend and it's your money that you're gaining on. When it's your debt, it's really rough. So the payment, there have been payments made, but, you know, again, at the end of the day, there's a question of resources and how much money is going to be available on a sustaining basis. And you can have a constitutional guarantee, but if there's no money to back it up, what is it worth?
Okay.
Just add
Anyone else?
quickly
Go, Daniel.
that, you know, I think it's fair to say that nobody in this discussion would argue that the state's history of failure to adequately fund the pension systems was the right thing to do or a good idea or sound. And all of us wish we could go back and undo that. And whether you want to call that wage theft or just a bunch of legislators and governors being idiots, you know, you can pick your favorite, but it was a horrible idea. And I do think it's important to structure the solutions we enact in such a way as to minimize or ideally eliminate the possibility of that happening going forward.
Okay, real quick, from our well-known leftist radical, Mark Weiermuller, who's somewhere off the curb on the right-hand side. Small business owner, used to be a large business owner. Okay, why not today put all new employees in IRAs, 401k, on FICA to start a phase-out? Is this a pyramid scheme? I can't explain it, I just read it. Go ahead, Amanda. Anyone.
I feel like this is Senator Biss's specialty, but I mean, in a way, you do have a structure where, I don't know if it's a pyramid scheme. What?
Mark Weiermuller is also my specialty.
A lot of pub. Go ahead.
I don't know if it's a pyramid scheme, but if right now what you do have is, it's close. I mean, it could tumble if it weren't for greater investments being put into it. So that is one of the big issues, yes, with moving to an IRA or 401k sort of formula. The tier 2 benefits right now are very much helping to pay off the tier 1 pension debt. Another issue that needs to, at some point, be resolved.
Dan, you want to jump in?
And I tried to address this in my initial comments. I think that we need to design a system that maximizes the odds of, while being affordable, also providing retirement security for workers. And I think the existing system that exists in most of the private sector is currently not working well. And so replicating it seems to me to be foolish. And a crisis like the one we have is an opportunity to do better than that, not to replicate those mistakes.
The other thing I think, Mark, you've got to look at, If you change to that 401k, in the long run, for those employees, it'll cost the state less money. For about a 10-year period in the short run, you're going to see an increase in the payment that we need to make, because those people aren't paying in, which is maybe where you came up with the pyramid idea, but they're not paying in, and so the state's going to have to increase their contribution. It is not an insignificant amount of money over the next decade to 12 years that we will see as a cash flow hit. So you either have to decide you're going to, it would probably cost about the equivalent of 1 percentage point of a tax increase above and beyond whatever else is done, just for that, or maybe you bond that out over 10 to 12 years and pay it off over a longer period of time to make it affordable. But people need to understand that 401k transition costs you money early on. It may save you in the long run, but you need more cash flow to do it up front.
And it doesn't erase the unfunded liability, so you still have all of that.
And one last point about the alleged long-term savings. Right now, according to the actuaries, Tier 2, as Amanda alluded to, has a negative cost. So if you were to replace the current Tier 2 benefit for new employees with something where the state is making a 6.2% FICA contribution, that does not save money unless, of course, the actuaries turn out to be dramatically wrong because people live 20 years longer than we're currently expecting, which would be a dramatic change in medical technology.
Okay, we have one more question, though. Now I have to reveal that I have the answer to all this. We have to elect the mayor's brother, Zeke Emanuel, as governor of the state of Illinois. You get to 75, we have no problem with you. Now granted, guys who are 74 may have slight objection, but it's kind of a clear-cut way to get rid of all this, isn't it?
Clear-cut.
Right, Mark? It's no problem. Okay, here we go. This is a very good question. I think all of you should jump in for a second because I think this will be a good way to end. I'm sorry we just running out of time, and we always try and stay on time. Ken Perello from Deloitte. Are there any states, and a City Club member, are there any states you look at as that indicates for what might happen in Illinois? For example, I understand there are similarities in Rhode Island to Illinois, albeit on a smaller scale. Who wants to? Any of you guys from Rhode Island?
No, Rhode Island is getting a lot of attention, right? Their state treasurer, who's now their governor, I believe, led a campaign, a citizens-oriented campaign to address their pension crisis. There are a lot of similarities between Rhode Island and Illinois, but it's been challenged, the pension reform changes. All of the pension reform changes that were in Senate Bill 1 that are being reviewed by the Supreme Court have been implemented in some form in other states. Rhode Island has taken the unique defense is they're going to have it decided by a jury trial for the constitutionality of their changes. And it remains really unclear how that is going to go, but it will be a citizens jury trial.
Good for you, Amanda.
Most other states don't do some of the things that Illinois does. Most other states fund their pensions at least those that are well-funded, according to what the actuaries say is the cost of the program. Most other states don't automatically increase your benefit 3% compounded every year, regardless of inflation. They usually have a COLA, which is one of the things that Senate Bill 1 was aimed at changing. So when I talk to my colleagues in other states and other communities, the thing that gave me a lot of fear several years ago was the recognition that most people didn't think Illinois would be able to solve its pension problem, that Illinois would actually fail. And when you look at a credit rating that's the worst in the country, when you look at the city of Chicago, whose credit rating is the lowest of any major city except for Detroit, which is already in bankruptcy, it should give all of us pause about how serious the situation is.
Anyone else? Dan?
I guess I'll just say the same thing in a different way because you're all eager to leave and so I'm sure want a recapitulation. Yes, of course we look at other states. Yes, there's a lot to learn, but the reason that we're here and the reason that this phenomenon Amanda described of all this interest in this issue in Illinois is that we do have a problem whose magnitude is unlike other states, without exception, actually. And that's, because of a lot of years of neglect. But it means that when people talk about other states from one point of view or another as a poster child for how to fix these problems, it's likely that the numerical size of what they were dealing with was not as great as what we're dealing with. And so we have to, I think, be cognizant of that as we evaluate potential solutions and gird ourselves for what it's going to take to find our way out of this.
And we have a different and more definite state constitutional clause as well.
Yeah, only a few states compared to ours, New York and Arizona, I think.
And one last statistic, though, that highlights, the depth of the problem we have here compared to other places. Most states will spend between 5 and 8% of their budget on their pension costs, and we are in the low 20s. So, and we were in the low 20s with the tax rate at 5%. So when we were taking in record high revenue by billions of dollars, from that number, we were getting about 22% of that having to go to pension payments when most states are 5 to 8. It's again, the notion of having to catch up when you've fallen behind is just immensely expensive.
How about a big round of applause for our people?
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.